Harry S. Truman was not born into power. He came from a modest farming family in Lamar, Missouri. Unlike many world leaders, he had no elite education or wealth to support him. He worked tirelessly on his family farm and later in small businesses. Truman's journey was defined by persistence, discipline, and self-belief. He rose through hardships and failures to eventually become President of the United States. This unlikely path made his leadership even more remarkable. Truman began his career in politics not by ambition, but by chance. He served as a county judge in Jackson County, Missouri, gaining a reputation for honesty. Despite criticism and setbacks, Truman stayed committed to fairness and public service. His reputation as the man of integrity started to spread. This humble beginning showed his sense of justice and loyalty to ordinary people. He was never the polished speaker, but his straightforward nature won trust. Truman's rise was slow, steady, and honest. In 1934, Truman was elected to the U.S. Senate. Initially, he was underestimated by colleagues who saw him as inexperienced, but Truman soon proved his worth by focusing on corruption and waste. During World War II, he led a Senate committee that exposed military mismanagement. This saved the U.S. billions of dollars and earned him national respect. The Truman Committee became a symbol of efficiency and honesty in government. This moment prepared him for even greater responsibilities. By 1944, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was running for his fourth term. Truman, though not seeking the role, was chosen as his vice president. He was a compromise candidate, trusted but not too controversial. Truman accepted reluctantly, knowing the weight of the responsibility. At the time, Roosevelt's health was failing, and few knew how soon Truman would take over. In just 82 days, Truman went from vice president to president. The world was about to change dramatically under his leadership. On April 12, 1945, Franklin D. Roosevelt passed away. Harry S. Truman was suddenly sworn in as the 33rd President of the United States. He had little preparation and carried enormous responsibility overnight. The Second World War was raging in Europe and the Pacific. Truman admitted to reporters, "I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." The weight of global war now rested on his shoulders. The fate of millions would depend on his decisions. When Truman became president, Nazi Germany was near defeat. He worked closely with Allied leaders to bring the war to an end. In May 1945, Germany surrendered, ending the war in Europe. Celebrations erupted across the United States and Allied nations. Truman reminded the world that freedom and justice had prevailed. But even as Europe rejoiced, the war in the Pacific still burned fiercely. The hardest decisions of his presidency were yet to come. By summer 1945, the war with Japan showed no signs of ending. Japanese forces fought fiercely, unwilling to surrender. Truman faced a decision that would shape history forever. The U.S. had developed a powerful new weapon, the atomic bomb. Truman was briefed about its destructive power, unlike anything seen before. He believed using it could save millions of lives by avoiding a full invasion. After agonizing over the choice, Truman approved the bombings. On August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. The blast destroyed the city and caused unimaginable suffering. Tens of thousands died instantly, and many more from radiation. Truman announced to the world that America had unleashed a terrible weapon. He justified the act as a way to end the war swiftly. But the human cost was catastrophic, and the world would never forget. Hiroshima became a symbol of both victory and horror. Just 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, another bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The destruction was again overwhelming. On August 15th, Japan finally surrendered, ending World War II. Truman announced victory, but with a heavy heart. He knew history would judge his decision for generations. The atomic age had begun, and Truman had opened its door. The world now lived under the shadow of nuclear power. With the war ended, Truman faced a new challenge: rebuilding peace. Millions were dead, cities destroyed, and nations in ruins. The United States had emerged as the strongest world power, but alongside it, the Soviet Union was rising as a rival. The seeds of the Cold War were being planted. Truman's leadership would now shape not only America, but the entire world order. His presidency was only just beginning. In July 1945, Truman met with Churchill and Stalin at the Potsdam Conference in Germany. The war in Europe was over, but tensions were already rising between the Allies. Truman demanded that Japan surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. Behind the scenes, he was secretly confident because the U.S. had just tested the atomic bomb successfully. This conference marked the beginning of visible mistrust between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. For Truman, it was a turning point, shaping his leadership in the Cold War. Truman faced one of the most difficult decisions in history: whether to use the atomic bomb. Military advisors told him it could save hundreds of thousands of American lives by avoiding a land invasion of Japan. But others warned of the moral consequences of unleashing such a devastating weapon. Truman, determined to end the war swiftly, authorized the bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. The world would never be the same again. On August 6th, the first bomb fell on Hiroshima, killing tens of thousands instantly. Just 3 days later, Nagasaki suffered the same fate. The destruction was beyond comprehension, cities reduced to ash within seconds. For Truman, the goal was clear: end the war and prevent further American casualties. But history continues to debate the morality of that choice. The atomic age had begun, and Truman had opened a door that could never be closed. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender. The war that had consumed the globe was finally over. Truman declared victory, but knew the world had changed forever. He was hailed as a hero at home, the president who ended World War II. Yet, in private, he understood the responsibility that came with the atomic bomb. The U.S. was now the only nuclear power, and the world's balance of power had shifted. After the war, Europe lay in ruins. Truman knew that without U.S. support, chaos and communism might spread. Though the Marshall Plan was officially launched later under his guidance, the seeds were planted right after the war. Truman began pushing for American aid to rebuild economies and create stability. His vision was clear: prosperity would be the best weapon against communism. By 1946, Winston Churchill declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. Truman listened carefully, realizing that the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union had crumbled. The US and USSR were now locked in a new kind of conflict: the Cold War. Truman's policy became clear. The United States would oppose Soviet expansion everywhere. A battle of ideology had begun: freedom versus communism. In 1947, Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, pledging U.S. support to nations threatened by communism. Greece and Turkey were the first to receive aid, preventing Soviet influence from spreading. This moment officially declared America as the global defender of democracy. Truman had set the stage for decades of U.S. foreign policy. His words echoed worldwide: "I believe it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples." The Marshall Plan poured billions into Western Europe, helping nations rebuild industries, railways, and homes. It was more than just aid. It was a strategic move to keep Europe free from Soviet influence. Factories roared back to life and trade revived. Truman's gamble paid off, securing allies and stabilizing the continent. For many Europeans, America was seen as both a savior and a powerful new leader of the free world. When Stalin blockaded West Berlin in 1948, Truman faced his first major Cold War crisis. Instead of retreating, he launched the Berlin Airlift. Day and night, American and British planes dropped food, coal, and supplies into the city. For nearly a year, Berlin survived only through the courage of pilots and Truman's determination. It was a stunning success, proving America's resolve to resist Soviet aggression. In 1949, Truman oversaw the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. For the first time in U.S. history, America entered a permanent military alliance during peacetime. It was a direct message to the Soviets. An attack on one would be an attack on all. With NATO, Truman cemented America's role as leader of the Western world, ensuring collective defense against communist expansion. By 1950, the Cold War was no longer just about speeches and threats. North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and later China, invaded South Korea. Truman made the bold decision to send American troops to defend South Korea under the United Nations flag. It was the first real military conflict of the Cold War. Truman believed if the U.S. did not act, communism would spread unchecked. The Korean War marked a turning point in his presidency, bringing both praise and criticism. For Truman, it was a test of America's global responsibility. The Korean War was not simple. General Douglas MacArthur, a celebrated World War II hero, pushed aggressively for expansion into China. Truman, however, feared it would start World War III. In a stunning move, Truman fired MacArthur in 1951, shocking the nation. Many Americans were outraged, seeing MacArthur as a hero betrayed. But Truman stood firm, saying, "I had to protect the Constitution." It was one of the boldest acts of civilian control over the military in U.S. history. By the early 1950s, Truman's approval ratings had plummeted. The Korean War dragged on, inflation rose, and Americans grew tired of conflict. Once celebrated as the leader who ended World War II, Truman was now criticized as a president leading the country into endless struggles. He was even mocked as the accidental president who had gotten lucky with Roosevelt's death. But Truman, true to his personality, did not chase popularity. He believed history, not headlines, would judge him fairly. Despite criticism, Truman was shaping the modern world. In 1949, he approved the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a military alliance of Western nations. NATO was America's promise to defend Europe against Soviet aggression. This was revolutionary. Before Truman, America avoided permanent alliances. Now, the U.S. was the leader of a global defense network. Truman's gamble tied America to Europe's future, creating a system that still exists today. At home, Truman tried to expand Roosevelt's New Deal with what he called the Fair Deal. He wanted national health insurance, better housing, and civil rights laws. But Congress blocked many of his proposals, calling them too ambitious. Despite this, Truman pushed forward. He desegregated the U.S. military in 1948, a landmark step for civil rights. It was a bold and unpopular move at the time, but it paved the way for future progress. Truman once again showed his willingness to act even when it cost him politically. In 1948, Truman faced re-election, and almost everyone predicted his defeat. Newspapers, pollsters, and even his own party doubted him. But Truman refused to quit. He campaigned across the nation by train, giving fiery speeches directly to the people. Against all odds, Truman defeated Republican Thomas Dewey in one of the greatest upsets in U.S. political history. The famous newspaper headline read, "Dewey defeats Truman." Truman held it up with a wide grin, a symbol of his fighting spirit. As his presidency continued, Truman's foreign policy became known as the Truman Doctrine. It was a clear promise that America would defend free nations against communist expansion. This doctrine set the stage for decades of U.S. involvement around the world, from Vietnam to the Middle East. It was both praised as visionary and criticized as a path to endless wars. But Truman believed it was necessary to protect democracy in a dangerous world. Few people know that during Truman's presidency, the White House was literally falling apart. Floors creaked, walls cracked, and the building was unsafe. Truman and his family had to move across the street to the Blair House while the White House was rebuilt from the inside. Truman joked about living in a boarding house, but the renovation preserved America's most iconic home. This lighter chapter of his presidency showed his down-to-earth humor. By 1952, with approval ratings low and the Korean War unresolved, Truman decided not to run for another term. He knew the country was ready for new leadership. When Dwight D. Eisenhower won the presidency, Truman left the White House with dignity. Unlike other presidents, he retired quietly to his hometown of Independence, Missouri. He lived modestly, writing his memoirs and walking the streets like an ordinary citizen. Truman proved that true leadership is not about wealth or power, but service. Harry S. Truman entered history as a man underestimated, doubted, and mocked. Yet his decisions, dropping the atomic bomb, launching the Marshall Plan, creating NATO, and standing firm in Korea, shaped the 20th century. He left office unpopular, but over time, historians came to admire his courage. Truman showed that sometimes the toughest choices are the right ones, even if no one thanks you in the moment. His legacy endures as a reminder that leadership requires not just power, but moral conviction,